Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined firstly by Chris Lee.
Hi guys.
Great to have you back on, mate. Thanks very much for joining us. And we're also joined today by Flemming Christensen. How are you, Flemming? It's great to have you on.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
Today we are going to be talking about Kjøbenhavns Boldklub, or KB as they're known, from Denmark. One of the members of the Club of Pioneers. They were, as far as we're aware, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, association football club on the European continent. And we're going to be covering them today from a historic perspective and also hearing some of Flemming's stories, supporting them, growing up supporting them, and what it was like when they eventually met their end, which we'll cover a bit later in the episode. But Flemming, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
I was born in 71, and I saw my first KB game in 78. And from the 83 season, I followed them regularly until the end in 91. I live in Copenhagen, and I know a lot about the early fan scene in Copenhagen, and also about FC Copenhagen, which I followed after KB.
Of course, that was one of the questions that I was going to ask you was, have you continued following KB in their current form, which is, of course, FC Copenhagen? So it's good to hear that you still do that. Of course, that's something that we'll touch on a little later on, because there's a lot of interesting dynamics in how you, I suppose, can almost transfer your support from one club to another. But in this case, maybe it's a little bit different because, the way the club eventually came to set themselves up. And of course, Chris Lee's been on the podcast before, joined us for the Football, Politics and Identity episode. He's an author, a podcaster, and just an all-round good guy.
Hi Rory, thanks again for having me on. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to relate to my first book, Origin Stories, which is about how the game got started in various different places. So we will come to that whole discussion which you mentioned about Kjøbenhavns Boldklub being the first on the European continent. Was it? Not sure about that.
Yeah, that's one of the points of contention. Maybe not so much one of the myths we're going to be busting today, but one of the issues that we're going to discuss because, as we've spoken about before, as was the case with football and its sort of fledgling years in Europe, it's always difficult to tell who's going to be the first and who's claiming to be the first, etc., when they come to be forming on the continent. But still, they were founded in, I think it was April 1876, so we're going quite far back. I mean, that even predates quite a lot of Scottish clubs, actually. And, of course, like many other what would become football clubs in Europe, they were sort of formed as a multi-sports association, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think this is where we have the debate about who is the oldest club in Europe. I should probably start the timeline. So there's obviously been football for centuries all around the world, as in kicking a ball. But it's not till 1863 that we get the codification of what we now know as the Football Association Rulebook, right? Which is football or soccer, depending on what you want to call it. Now that's 1863. So you have clubs that exist that were playing their own rules that still keep going, like Sheffield FC 1857, which is the oldest club going still. The oldest professional club, of course, people may know, is Notts County. You get clubs like Wrexham, formed in 1864. Nottingham Forest, 1865. Queen's Park, the first in Scotland, in 1867. So when we're talking about 1876 as a foundation year for Copenhagen Boldklub, or KB as we should probably call it because it's a lot easier to say, in 1876, that is really quite early in the European context or even the global context. However, it depends how you want to define the first, because the Le Havre Athletic Club, so HAC as they're known, who's still going in France, in Ligue 1, the top flight, they have been going since 1872. However, they were playing some kind of mixed rules game beforehand, founded by former alumni of Oxford and Cambridge. And they still have a club theme tune set to the tune of God Save the King, actually. And then in 1879, you have FC St. Gallen, the first team in Switzerland. Now, the difference there being St. Gallen actually play football as the first sport. They were founded to play football, whereas KB were founded in 1876 as a multi-sports club, and they effectively didn't start playing football. But they played a game which apparently was quite close to sort of rugby in 1879, the same year that St. Gallen was founded. But they kind of did move to football, and they were, particularly the chairman of theirs called Frederick Markman, who's a solicitor. He was really pivotal because he came on board in 1880, and he in 1887 translated the association rules into Danish, and that obviously opens it up a lot more. He's pivotal in the creation of the oldest football association outside of Britain and Ireland. So that is the Danske Boldklubben. I'm sure that, Flemming, you can help me with my pronunciation, but that's founded in 1889. That's what you'll see on the lovely kit. So that's kind of helped kind of galvanise the sport, I suppose, and helps get it into schools and things like that, because they were playing cricket and things like that. Quite strangely, I was really surprised when I was researching the book to find that in Denmark they play cricket, but that wasn't uncommon, because there's only two ways that football leaves Britain and arrives in other countries at this point in the 1860s and 70s, and this is either through expat communities in port cities like Genoa, Le Havre, Copenhagen, or Buenos Aires, Montevideo, places like this, or students who've come over to the UK, played the game and taken it back. And so it's kind of a bit of both with Denmark, really, but it's mostly sort of Anglophile private schools, I imagine, and gentlemen who had time on their hands to play football. And it's in that sort of the area where kind of the heart and soul of Danish football still is, which is where the Parken Stadium is. It Fjolland Park or something? Flemming, you can probably tell me where the Parken Stadium is now, which is where FC Copenhagen play.
It's Copenhagen is it's quite a small big city. When in the end of the 1800s, when they tear down the city walls to build cheap house tenements outside the walls, there was a small field called the commons. Like in the Middle Ages, the villagers had this common shared field for sheep. That's the only green area in central Copenhagen. So there's a lot of clubs. We call them fælde clubs, common clubs. I think there's over 10 or 15 of them. So many of the Copenhagen clubs origins from that field.
Wow.
And later on, some of them move out to suburbs, where the local majors promised them a stadium and training grounds. But a few remains in Copenhagen, and one of them is Kobe, which actually has their training ground in a area of the city called Frederiksberg, which is an independent borough in Copenhagen, and there they have quite good facilities. But still today, there's a lot of small clubs playing over at Parken.
So that's quite interesting. It's like Palmerston Park in Dumfries. Dumfries is much smaller than Copenhagen, but it's a town in the southernmost coast of Scotland. But every team that's ever come from Dumfries has played at Palmerston Park, where Queen of the South still play today. Edinburgh Powder Hall was huge for the development of football in Edinburgh. In Glasgow, it was the area around the East End, Barrowfield, Shawfield, etc. And of course, Queen's Park and Kinnins Park on the south side. So in every town and city in the world, you'll see these similar kind of origin points where these fields of play were sometimes the only places where people could play football, and that's where the football in the city really develops and grows from there,
In Berlin, it's Tempelhof, which is now an airport. So it's kind of like, which you can walk around. The public park is part of the Berlin airlift, and it's been closed. But I just wanted to kind of wrap up the context is that Denmark is really quick off the mark in terms of football. It's a founder member of FIFA in 1904. And by 1908, it's at the Olympics in London, which is kind of like the first proper football tournament, I suppose. They get silver. They're having beaten France 17-1 on the way, and French kind of refused to finish their roster of fixtures after that, just out of pique, I suppose. And then in 1912 again in Sweden, GB won the gold in 1908. They also won it in 1912 in Sweden, and Denmark finished with silver medal again. And that's just kind of, there's a big gap, which I'm sure that Flemming will fill in terms of the KB story. But Denmark doesn't professionalise until 1978, and I guess this kind of helps bring through that sort of generation, that golden generation that comes in the Danish dynamite of the 80s and early 90s, culminating with the 92 Euro win. And they've always kind of been there or thereabouts since. And 92 is obviously the year that KB merges with Bold Club, 1903, for Boldklubben, to form what is now FC Copenhagen. So, that's just the sort of context of the historical context of how football got to Denmark and where KB fits into its story.
Something that was quite interesting, obviously the footballing department, if you like, of KB was added to the club in, I think it was around 1878 or the early 1880s, sorry. But they didn't win their first trophy, or according to the sources, they didn't win their first trophy until around 1912-13. But was that because the trophies were a lot more amateur? Was it because the trophies were a lot more transient in nature, where they were there 1 minute and gone the next? Or was it because that football in Denmark was a lot more unorganised, and it wasn't until really the early 1900s that it began to get organised? It's something that I was just quite curious about, to see if there were any earlier triumphs for the club that they can attach their name to.
I think the Danish championships until I think after the First World War, it was a Copenhagen championship. It was about five clubs who shared the medals, and I think it was about a couple of years after the First World War. They spread it through the country with regional FAs who had one winner who has to play with the Copenhagen clubs. So it was sort of discriminating towards the rest of the country. In many years, the DBU, Danish FA, thought that the provincial clubs were too crabby to participate. And that's why we were the first Danish champions. Outside Copenhagen, you have to go to 1953 to find someone outside Copenhagen. That was Køge, a small club from Zealand who won.
No, it's quite interesting. Again, it's just something that I was quite curious about, because through their history, KB were an incredibly successful cup. I mean, they won the Danish Cup 5 times, I think. They won the Danish League 15 times, which is a huge number, and I mean, easily one of the, if not the most successful club going through that period of Danish football history. And then, of course, things kind of start to take a little bit of a tumble, and they start to slide down a little bit. But then, of course, the merger sort of takes place. Which Chris alluded to, and I suppose, Flemming, this is where you're here to help us fill in the gaps, I suppose. Now, as you mentioned, you have been, well, you supported KB and you support FC Copenhagen and have done so for a very, very long time. So I suppose, is KB something that you were brought up with, or is it something that you were drawn to? Is it something that runs in your family?
Well, I was drawn to it because I had a schoolmate. His father took us into to Parken Stadium, and then I was sold. There was at that time there was no atmosphere in the stadium, but KB had a little crowd of supporters with drums and singing and cheering. So I just fell for it.
Brilliant. So your friend got you to go along to these games, and it became a long-standing thing. And I suppose it's safe to say that you've never really looked back, have you?
No.
So in the 70s and the 80s, when you were growing up supporting their club, how can you compare their success to how they were in, I suppose, the 50s or even the 60s? Because it seems like after really the 50s, they started to go in a little bit of a downward trajectory.
From the 40s, 50s and 60s, there was a huge number of crowds in the stadiums. And sometimes there was... in one afternoon, there was 2 games in Parken, and there could be 30,000 to the first and 20,000 to the second game. But when we entered the 70s and 80s, I think that's for most of Europe, the attendances went dramatically down. So I always think the 70s was a great period in all, in football, in clothing, in music. It really sucks And when it comes to the 80s here in Denmark, we had something we call it the poor 80s, because economics was really tough on most people. So most didn't spend the money for a ticket. And I know in England too, we are growing up with Saturday was one of the highlights in our week, because we could see one English game every Saturday. And when I remember the stadiums, they were not sold out in the 80s, except maybe for Liverpool. The 80s was a hard period, but anyway, it also was the beginning of the start of what is now the ultra culture in Denmark.
Yeah, I think that's the thing as well. But many people obviously remember and attached to this what ultimately was a massive subculture movement. And as you mentioned, there was all these different things play into it. You had football, which was the sort of wider thing that people attached themselves to. It was the clothing, it was the music, it was the fan scene, the fanzines, just everything around football culture really that makes growing up and going through your formative years supporting a club, a lot more fun. Chris, was there anything in your book that you covered about KB kind of during this period? I know you tended to focus more on the sort of origin stories of the clubs, of course, but did you cover anything sort of in the lead up to their merger?
Well, what I'm interested in actually from the 60s and 70s, obviously in the early 60s we get Brøndby coming along, was this sort of big other club in Copenhagen, and they obviously have that big rivalry in Copenhagen now, which has become quite a thing. So I'll be really interested to hear from Flemming when that sort of derby came around, given how many other clubs there are within Copenhagen, and also how it changed in '92 after the merger, because that'd be really interesting.
We met Brøndby a few times in the 80s, because KB was a escalator team, up down. So every second season we met Brøndby, and at first it was just another suburb club. We didn't hate them, we didn't love them, but things changed in '85, because Brøndby became the first full professional team in Denmark, and everyone likes to beat them. But then we were too small to beat their big rivals. That came when with FC København. At the first game out there was fighting around the stadiums, and everyone was surprised, because no one expected it, but it was pretty tough.
Just a curious point that came up there. Was part of the rivalry and part of the animosity because Brøndby became the first professional club in Denmark, and maybe KB fans felt that they were stepping on their toes a little bit, perhaps?
Yeah, we because of our history, we in our minds we should be number one, and that small suburb club. No one liked the idea, but also then every club liked to beat Brøndby, but Brøndby also in the 80s got a Denmark-wide support, because they did good in the European Cups, reached the semi-finals against Roma one year. So still today, I think Brøndby has the most followers Denmark-wide, and always have a massive support when they play away.
No, I was just curious to see it, and as you sort of alluded to there, I suppose KB were the first. So when another club comes on the scene and claims to be the first, even if it's for something else, you're not going to like that, are you? So
I was just interested to hear from Flemming. You mentioned there was sort of violence in '92 when Brøndby and FCK kind of like met. I'm just interested, is there a history of that beforehand in violence in Danish football? Because it really surprised me. I always think Denmark is all chill and everyone's fine. and kind of happy with their lives. But it sounds obviously there must be the same societal pressures that lead certain young men to want to violence and around football. And I just wondered if there was a history of that beforehand, or is this kind of something new that erupted in the 90s or emerged in the 90s, and how that was viewed within Danish society as a whole?
No, there's always been small fights, but probably only between 2 or 3 drunk men. It was nothing we heard about. The only episode I've been told was when England visited in '79. That was heavy fights from the railway station down to the stadium. But England away in the '70s, '80s. So that's all. In club football, it was almost. It was very peaceful. It all came when they formed the new Super League in Denmark, and then it become. I think that just if you look around other countries, we are staying compared to Sweden. They have a big scene over there with rivalries and fighting, and I think some inspiration came to Danish supporters from the Swedes, and then it just grew. But it's usually only between Brøndby and Copenhagen.
My other question, given the geography, and I have done the train from the bridge from Malmö across to Copenhagen, and I'm really interested to know, obviously, different leagues, but is there any kind of either rivalry or the Italian word is gemellaggio, a sort of twinning of ultras between any of the Copenhagen clubs and Malmö? Because you're so, you can almost see them from across the water there.
Yeah, there's a lot of hatred between Copenhagen and Malmö, but it's because of in the late 90s, Copenhagen supporters got friends with Helsingborg, the second largest city in Skåne, the Swedish area where Malmö is the main city, and that is continuing until today. So when Helsingborg played in Malmö, a lot of Copenhagen supporters came over to support and help them. So still today, there's a lot of hatred between the two cities. But I think it's only because of that, because Danes always look down on Swedes. We think they are too stiff upper lips. We are not like the funny guys of Scandinavia, and they are just boring. So.
Yeah, no, it's great hearing these sort of different dynamics between the countries. That's a really interesting question as well, Chris. I had always wondered if, because of the close proximity to Malmo, if there was any sort of living between the football fans there and things like that. So I suppose, Flemming, as you were growing up with the club, and as you mentioned, there's music, there's clothing, there's this entire scene and subculture revolving around football at the time. Were you a part of that? Tell us some of your stories supporting KB.
I think one of the first ultra things I participated in was about 87. We got a lot of flares and small rockets when we took them to the parking stadium, and at one time we fired them all, and then the board of Copenhagen came running across the pitch to and shouted, no, stop it, that's too crazy, and from that on we never looked back. 10 years later, every club were doing the same. We also use the megaphone to shout in, to make people singing together, and it wasn't that many, but it was fun.
Yeah, it's a type of thing that you do in your formative years when you're growing up supporting a club. You're doing this thing with all of your friends. It's for the same purpose. It's for the same reason, and yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And the things like the board coming out to tell you off. And in some cases, more extreme things like getting involved in fights with other fan groups is part of what makes ultras culture at the end of the day. And it's something that's part of the discussion of football. Whether or not, of course, you were involved in any fights, that's a different story. But of course, we then come into the 90s, and this is where the story of KB's kind of comes to an end, because in the end, they go through a merger and become what is now SCK or FC Copenhagen. So I suppose there's kind of a couple of sides to this story. Obviously, Flemming, we have the perspective of you as the fan. So tell us a little bit about the merger.
I think football was dying in Copenhagen, and there is a lot of small. I think too many clubs in the Copenhagen area, and if there has to be an opponent to Brøndby, a merger was the only thing to do. B93 had the players, and KB has the history and the knowledge and the facilities, but it didn't came out of love. It was necessary, but all my mates and I, we just wanted KB to be what KB was. We liked it. A couple of thousand of supporters to a game, and we always lost, but we had a good time. So no one was happy about the merger, and there was a discussion of what are we going to do next? Do we support FC Copenhagen? Do we find another club? Do we just stop watching football? And for the group, all three things happened. Most went to FC Copenhagen because of the mates, and me too. It was only because of it was the guys I've been having fun and drinking with for years. So we just continue to FC Copenhagen. But I still know a couple of guys who never have seen FC Copenhagen game live. Never will go. So it was a sad period.
Yeah, it would have been. I mean, this club that you've grown up with is, it's kind of different. A lot of the clubs that we cover obviously go defunct, and it's mainly because of financial mismanagement. And there's differences in it. And in some ways, sometimes a merger can be worse. Sometimes it can be better because there is still a club to support. But it's like, well, yes, when a club goes defunct, yes, it's gone, but you still have all the things that you attached yourself to. It still had its crest, it still had its colours. It's still something that you're able to talk about. Whereas if a club merges, yes, you can talk about those things, but it still kind of exists through this thing that's not really yours. So there's this massive sort of alienation that takes place between fans. And obviously, as you mentioned, some people did still go to support them because of their friends. I can imagine as well because if, they wanted the club to stand up to Brøndby, or maybe even some of them saw FCK as a natural progression from KB. All of these things are possible, and all of these things happened. Inverness probably being the Scottish example when Inverness Thistle and Caledonian FC merged to form Inverness Caledonian Thistle, and a lot of people similarly have never gone to see Inverness Cali Thistle before because they say it's not their club, and that's entirely fair as well. And I think when mergers happen, all people see is these clubs are merging to make this big club so that they can go on and be successful, whereas actually on the underside of it, there's a lot of people who feel like they're left without a football club representing them.
Yeah, and that happened with Wimbledon, didn't it, when they were kind of effectively taken over, moved to Milton Keynes as MK Dons, and obviously then the new Phoenix club, AFC Wimbledon, then rose up the ranks, and now they're kind of around the same level. So, yeah, I mean, it's I think traditionalist fans will always support whoever claims to be the original. I think there's an example of that in Portugal as well. A team called Belenenses also kind of got their top flight license taken by someone else, and then they started another Phoenix club, which has now come up. So it does happen, and it is divisive, as you say. So they play. I think they played at Kjøbenhavn. I don't know what's happened to them. I haven't followed the story, to be honest. But I know that the other ones played at Østelle, which was their old the old Belenenses grounds. They stayed there, and that's one of my favourite grounds in the world. I've got to say, just for the setting, it's actually aesthetically, it's just like an athletic stadium, but it's the setting when you're looking over the Monasterio de Jerónimos, which is basically the UNESCO World Heritage Site monastery, and you've got the River Tagus behind you, the backdrop, and there's all these monkey puzzle trees and all this lovely sunset because it's facing west. So yeah, it's just a really lovely ground on top of the hill in a place called Belém, or Belém, which is part of where the pastiche de nata come from. So it's quite sort of culinary fame as well as footballing fame. And of course, Belenenses is one of only just 2 clubs outside Portugal's big 3 to have won the title, the other being Boa Vista, Porto.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and again, it's, you know, I think it was someone on Twitter, I think, said to us, you know, Bissado, one of the most hated clubs in Portugal, and it was because of this situation with the merger. But again, it's common, and clubs that go through a merger always end up, there's always going to be a group of fans that don't buy into it, and that's fine. You know, you can't discredit them for that because, as I said, they're taking away their club. But of course, Flemming, you chose to continue following FCK, and you have been doing so since the merger. How has it been? How does it compare to following KB? Have you felt now that it's, FCK have been around for 32, 33 years now? How do you feel now? Do you feel like an FCK fan more than a KB fan, or is there always that element of this isn't entirely my club still?
The older I get, the more I think of KB, and I miss those days. But in the 80s, we always dreamt about a massive support, filled stadiums, and championships, and success in Europe, and somehow we got it through FC Copenhagen. So it's been a good period, but I still miss KB. And, you know, KB is still around if you're a youth player. So I still see the blue and white striped T-shirts when I walk the streets. So, and that's man, that goes to the heart.
You said there, obviously, when you were young and growing up, you wanted a full stadium, you wanted championships, and you wanted success in Europe. Has the trade-off been worth it?
To be honest, yes, because we would never have had such success with a lot of small Copenhagen clubs. Brøndby would have been like Real Madrid or Barcelona, and no one to compete with them. So
yeah,
it has been good for Danish football.
I suppose that's all you can really ask for at the end of the day. And of course, FC Copenhagen are a massive club now. Probably kind of poisoned themselves to become the biggest in Denmark, I'd say, now. And, you know, Danish football seems to be in quite a good period at the moment. Of course, the FCK merger, if you like, kind of coincided with probably one of the biggest shocks in European football history when Denmark won the Euros. Just asking, as you know, from my perspective, what does it feel like to see your country win the Euros? Because I don't think it's something that I'll experience for quite some time.
I think we were a small country that will only happen one time in 100 years. So I don't expect success for the national team every time. I think if you can make a good figure every 20 years, it's okay. Look like Scotland, for example. Both countries has about 6 million people, and it's really hard to have success with only 6 million people in football.
Yeah, there is a way to do it though, and I'd say that countries like Denmark, countries like Sweden, Norway, and other smaller nations, even Ireland to an extent, I would say that Ireland's system and Denmark and Norway's system of bringing youth players through the academies is much better than Scotland's, and in a much better position than Scotland's, to be honest. And I think that's what a lot of people are realising for us now is how much of that this might actually be an issue moving forward. But, you know, only time's going to tell with that. And after another really, really poor tournament, you can only hope that the changes are going to come reasonably soon.
But the example I'd point to is Croatia, because that's even smaller, and yet they've totally overachieved. Is that generational? I'm not sure it is, because they continue in the 90s. They were good as well after they broke out of Yugoslavia. So what's going on there, what's in the water down there. They're also, when it comes to athletics, I think they're kind of per head of population the most successful Olympic country as well, along with New Zealand, I think, something like that. There's a very weird stat about these very small countries like Croatia. Obviously, New Zealand excels at another sport, but like it's there is something in there, like you said, funding, facilities, and the right kind of coaching and mindset, a winning mindset. I think that also comes with habit. Confidence.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. And Slovenia as well, incredible sporting nation, not just football, of course, skiing, basketball, ice hockey, loads of other sports that are really, really popular there. But what has ended up happening is the people that go into football, because there's this huge sporting culture in Slovenia, is that they're all just incredible athletes. And I think we've just seen that in the tournament that they've just played in, how they performed. It was absolutely incredible. The amount of running, the amount of physicality in that team was just absolutely magnificent, and they've done themselves really, really proud. Just before we finish things up, Flemming, I just wanted to ask some of your most memorable moments following KB. First of all, what your favourite match was growing up following the club before they merged into FCK?
It was in '91. We was away in Odense. It's the third biggest city in Denmark. They have in Odense they have two stadiums, and there's only a gate between them. We were in the second division and had to win to make it back. And on the other stadium, OB Odense BK played AGF from Aarhus, which was our friends at that time. I don't think you have it in Great Britain, but in Europe, it's very common that in your own country you have a friendly club. In Germany, for example, which was a big inspirator for us. Some of us took in the 80s. We took down to Hamburg to watch Hamburg. They were friends with Borussia Dortmund, and the fans had a good time together when they met. And we had a friendship with AGF from Aarhus. So during the match, we went from one stadium to the other and saw both games, and we really got pissed after the match. So that's one of the most memorable games I have. But sadly, we lost that friendship because of the merger, because the AGF fans didn't want to be friends with B 1903, so which is the other club in the merger. So that was sad.
Yeah, that's quite frustrating actually. A bit of a weird one as well, because I suppose I know that a lot of these friendships are based around club colours, of course, and badges and things like that. And there's obviously a massive element of that within Ultras culture, as Chris mentioned earlier, the kind of Gemelagio. But you'd think that the people would also want to stay friends with the people as well, and not want that friendship to dissipate just because there's been a merger. So there's kind of two sides to that, and I can almost understand both of them. Who was your favourite player to play for KB that you saw?
I think Torben Picnic. He later went to Liverpool, and he was also European champion in '92. I think he was my favorite, and of course the goalkeeper Ole Quist, who was a national player. He was a goalkeeper. He was in the Euros in '84. He was rather small, but he was the best goalkeeper Denmark had. And also he was in his civil life, he was a police motorcycle man. So sometimes you could see him in the roads in Copenhagen.
Brilliant. Yeah, it would have been great seeing those guys live as well. Of course, Kiwi had quite the roster of players in the end that came through the ranks and ended up moving on. So, there's obviously a massive element of remembrance to that. Seeing all those guys coming through your club and then going off to greater heights must have been something as well. course, because KB are considered to be one of, if not the oldest club on the European continent, they are a member of the Club of Pioneers. Chris, do you want to explain to our listeners what the Club of Pioneers is? Because I think you could do a better job than I have. Obviously, this is something that you've covered quite a bit.
Yeah, it's an initiative by Sheffield FC, the world's oldest football club, which we mentioned before. So anyone who is the oldest club in a particular country can join the Club of Pioneers. There's clubs like Genoa from Italy. You've got sort of the Copenhagen Boldklub and various others, even the Maltese entries and things like that. So there's quite a diverse group. They have had like get-togethers in the past as well, but yeah, it's a really interesting initiative, I think, in terms of just celebrating the original clubs from those countries, because often it's a story that gets lost, especially in this sort of hyper commercialized era of football. We kind of forget where it comes from. And I did a blog post on this recently, actually. The most successful clubs, the first clubs in various countries don't tend to be the most successful. Maybe enjoy some early success like Queen's Park did. I think Queen's Park won a large amount of Scottish Cups, but they haven't won them since the 19th century or something like that, and they still have the third amount of cups, something like that.
Yeah, so Queen's Park won their last Scottish Cup, I think, in 1910 or around then, but they are still the third most club, the third club behind Celtic and Rangers that have won the most Scottish Cups. So, they were incredibly successful. In fact, they were probably the best team in the world at the time.
And Genoa as well, which is a particularly sad story, because in Italy you get a star when you win 10 Scudetti, 10 titles. And they're on 9. They've been stuck on 9 for nearly a century, since 1924 or 5, I think. So it's really sad, and they don't look like they're going to get one anytime soon. But so it's clubs like that that are part of it. So it's definitely worth looking into, and it's good that they're sort of celebrated.
I'm just quite interested in Flemming, because the Club of Pioneers is something that I've been interested in. Of course, Chris has written about it and studied it and researched it much more than I have, but it's something I've been quite keen on from a sort of initiative perspective. Or were you aware that KB was a part of the Club of Pioneers?
Of course I know they're the eldest club on the continent. I didn't know Chris has wrote a book about the pioneering clubs, but I'm really glad that he, as a historian, specializes in that field, because that's an important part of being human. The football culture, it means a lot to many people, because societies are now being that there's not so much religion anymore, but I think football has taken that place for many. So it's a really big part of life. That he's doing that work, I think it's very great.
No, I'd completely agree with you. I think knowing your club's history and knowing where they come from, and therefore just even being able to see something like this club have been in this area for X amount of years, and knowing that your grandparents or great-grandparents would have also supported that club and went to the same places, there's something really special in that, and that's where the heritage of it comes in, and knowing where your club is rooted in. But as you said, what Chris does is incredibly important, because he documents everything there is to know about these clubs. He charts their history so that there is something that's going to be there, because as you mentioned, otherwise it's something that could end up being lost, and that's not something that we want. It's something that happens in countries that are in states of war. It happens when there's genocide taking place or forms of ethnic cleansing, is that football clubs, along with a lot of other things, get erased. That's a huge part of people's lives that is just no longer there. And to go back what I was saying previously about the Club of Pioneers, it's interesting that, they're obviously a very prestigious organisation, because they're literally a group of the very first football clubs to be formed in different nations, but not a lot of people are actually aware of them. And even if they just had something like a Club of Pioneers pre-season tournament or something to try and promote themselves a little bit more, it just seems a bit odd to me that it's not something that they've tried to pursue before and try and make people a little bit more aware of the incredible history that's attached to their organisation.
They have had tournaments in the past. I think Thomas Scuravi was represented Genoa at one of them. If you remember him, I think he came back for one of the games. I think Carlton Palmer turned out, I think, and Chris Waddle, I think, turned out for the Sheffield side. So obviously they both played for Sheffield Wednesday at one point. So no, they have done that in the past, but I guess it's all about time and opportunity, really, and for them to do that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that will be a massive part of it as well, as capacity, whether the clubs want to be involved in things like that. But I know that it's not always up to certain organisations to try and promote these things, but you know, a little bit more exposure, or a little bit more presence from them would be good, just to, you know, try and educate people on the history of these clubs, and even just go into the origins of football and the particular nations that they come from. So,
well, there is one game that does take place pretty regularly, and that's the Rules Derby, which is the world's two oldest clubs. That's Sheffield FC against its rival Hallam. I went to their ground, actually, Sandy Mountain Lane, something like that, in Sheffield, not so long ago, actually, which is it's a cricket pitch as well, as obviously it's how it started out, but it's also the oldest ground that's still being used for football. So that's where they first played in Boxing Day 1860. And of course, they're playing Sheffield rules in those days. But they do meet pre-season, so I've seen them at Sheffield FC's ground before. But they're not in the same league. I think they're 7th and 9th tier or something like that in English Pyramid. So, you know, the standard's not great. But they're both amateurs, so it's like, you know, it's it's just the history is so rich.
Exactly, it's a bit of a memorial match, isn't it? And that's important in itself as well. It's celebrating that kind of proud heritage that they have. Flemming, if KB were to come back in a senior form, would you start following them again, even if it meant they had to start quite low down in the Danish football league system?
Definitely, yes. I will be there because if FC Copenhagen collapses, B 1903 has the license to play in the football league, and KB must start in the lowest division, so I'll be there.
Good man. Still dedicated to his club, and that's ultimately what we like to see. Chris, is there anything else that you'd like to ask Flemming just before we finish up for today?
No, thanks for the insight. I haven't been to a game in Denmark yet, and I need to. It's like, I mean, especially the derby, it looks incredible. But yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting sort of scene going on.
Definitely. I guess, you know, Flemming would recommend to anyone to get over and see a game, because the fan scene looks absolutely amazing as well.
Copenhagen is quite popular at the time. We got a Scottish guy from Glasgow. I think he's been here the last year about 15 times.
Wow.
Football brings the most odd friendships.
Yeah, it does. You're absolutely spot on. It brings the strangest friendships and some of the strangest habits from the supporters as well. Flemming, Chris, thank you very much for joining me this morning to talk about the story of Kjøbenhavns Boldklub, or KB, who were the first football club in Denmark, formed depending on who you ask. Been a great episode. To all of our listeners, thank you once again for tuning into this episode. If there's a topic that you want us to cover that revolves around football history, heritage, identity, culture, community, or any of the other things that we tend to talk about, then please do get in touch. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Also check out some of the content that's going up on our website. Our contributors and writers do a fantastic job with the written content that goes up there, and there's no better time to get involved. So if that's something you fancy doing as well, please get in touch and we'll see what we can arrange with you. But for now, Flemming, say goodbye.
Goodbye, thanks.
Chris, say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.
And we'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.